So one of the things that I've been working on is trying to achieve a kind of collective consciousness. I think that we have been individuals too long. And so I also, as I mentioned, have a bad rap and people say that I talk too much, mainly my wife. So she always interrupts me when I'm speaking. But I think perhaps we could try something that we are here together. I will tell you what I have to say. We will try to interact with one another, but I hope that we'll come together as part of humanity, as relatives working together, understanding, thinking together with a collective or collaborative intention. So, although I have a reputation to uphold about talking, I'm going to ask and try to achieve silence for a moment. Now it feels like Quaker meeting, and I'm loath to break the silence. I have to gather courage in order to speak. I'm very thankful that I have the opportunity to be here, and I'm very thankful that you've come here. I'm especially thankful for Skeeter, for all he's done I think, for decades. And it's really great to come out here. I must say I have not been in this place before, and it's very beautiful. And those of you who live here are blessed to be able to be in this environment. My father is Chinese, and my mother is American of Scottish descent. So I'm involved. My life is odd. I have grown up with many influences from different cultures. Very typical, I guess. More and more people are this way. And I have lived in China for 40 years. I went there initially to open the CBS News Bureau at the time of normalization of relations between China and the United States. I was 26 years old. I'm 66 years old now. We built a house we had a family, our family, and we all grew old. And in this time, I learned a lot because I was focusing on the geopolitical events, and these were epic. China rose from poverty and isolation, the Soviet Union collapsed, and I had a front row seat. But then, in 1995, the World Bank asked me to go to the Loess Plateau. This is in the upper and middle reaches of the Yellow River. So now, if you forgive me, I'm going to speed up. When I got to the Loess Plateau, it was massively degraded. So I was very surprised that the birthplace of the largest ethnic group on the planet looked like the moon. And I wondered, how could this be possible? So this is what I saw when I got to the Loess Plateau. So this is really what I want to talk about. How do we solve these problems? We know a lot about degradation. We know a lot about evolution. And what we really need to know is, how do we change this? So this is in 1995 when I first went to the Loess Plateau, and what you're going to see next is 2009, when I made a film called Hope in a Changing Climate for the BBC. So this was broadcast around the world one day before the Copenhagen COP15, and it has shaped the direction that climate thinking has gone since that time. Again, 1995, and then 2009. So what we see here is that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems. We don't have to accept degraded states. Those of you who have worked in permaculture know this very well. So what I want to show you now, so now you have seen, this is why people call me to come to conferences, because this and the fact that over the last 25 or 30 years, I've gone to Africa and to other countries to study this, and I've shared the example of China with other parts of the world, and they have begun to enlarge the body of work. And we see that in Africa, in Rwanda, in Ethiopia, you can see the results of using nature-based solutions, using regenerative, restorative things. So there's a lot of science in here that is critically important, but I want to show you the edge of where we are now, and I also really want to go outside as soon as we possibly can. So I want to show you a few things. So I'm going to drop that now, and I'm going to show you this. So what do you see? Well, what? All right. This is the Sinai Peninsula. And if you know much about this, it was the prized real estate in the region. And now, if you go there, it looks like the Loess Plateau. So this is kind of the edge of where I'm working. So for your information, I am the ecosystem ambassador for the Common Land Foundation. I'm a researcher at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. I'm a visiting fellow there. I am working with an organization which is a holistic design or holistic engineering company called the Weathermakers. And I am the founder of the Ecosystem Restoration Camps movement. So what's interesting about this is when you look at this map, what do you see? So like the thing that stands out to me, partly because they didn't put the United States in the middle, but what stands out for me is this big yellow part in the middle. To me, it looks like a highlight pen was drug over that with that kind of yellowish highlighting. And it doesn't look like the other parts of the world. It looks very different. And the fact is, this is the cradle of Western civilization. This is the place where the materialistic domination thinking originated and has been spread all over the world. And what has happened in that area is it's a desert. And people walk around with weapons. It's a very dangerous place. And the holistic engineering company, about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, was asked by an official of the Egyptian government to look into an area which is, let's see where we are, which is called Lake Bar de Ville. It's in the northern Sinai. So this is a kind of a representation of the degradation. So you can imagine Mount Sinai, or they call it Mount Catherine. That must be a Christian term, so it has to be connected to the Crusades, I suspect. And over here is Lake Bar de Ville. And what's interesting about Lake Bar de Ville is it was 40 meters deep. And it was there were inlets from the Mediterranean Sea. And this place had a very benign area for aquatic life. It was a nursery for the aquatic life in the Mediterranean. Now, Lake Bar de Ville, the reason it has this natural definition between the lake and the Mediterranean Sea is because of natural occurrence of calcium carbonates. They created coral reefs that grew up and divided this. But now, the depth of this lake is 1.5 meters. And it's completely filled up with sediments. And what's interesting about this is when you do this, you change 40 meters to 1.5, the water is hypersaline, and the temperatures are vastly hotter, so it's no longer a nice environment in the Mediterranean. And so when we look at these impacts and we start to consider this, we realize that through the historical references, through soil core samples, we can tell that this place was not always like this. This place was very different. This is the land of milk and honey. This is the place where you lay down in green pastures. And over time, it was completely destroyed. So this is very similar to what happened in China. But so far, nobody has said, let's fix it. I think the Chinese have gotten a little bit weird because they think they can do all sorts of things, and in fact, they can. So it's not complete arrogance and insanity. They can. But this is what we need to do now. So what we found in studying this area was that we could understand the changes. The vegetation was lost. All of the rainfall caused the sediments to go into the lake. And then the temperatures on the surface were vastly higher. And with these temperatures, what happens is, there is a term in ecology, probably you all know about this, is called evapotranspiration. Well, that is the conflation of two different measurements. Respiration, plant respiration mainly, and evaporation. Well, if you've gotten to this point, I don't think you want this particular measurement anymore. You want to know what the evaporation rates are, because you don't have any respiration. You want to study the changes in evaporation. And what we find is that these temperature differentials on the surface cause enormous thermal drafts, which move the moist air, which is coming in from evaporation off the sea, into the upper atmosphere. When it does this, they're no longer available to condense into clouds and precipitate as rain. So we've started to look at what causes condensation and precipitation. And there's quite a bit of data on this. It's actually, some people are, but some areas, it's kind of arcane area. The people who are doing geoengineering would be thinking about this. The Chinese are altering the weather. And we need to think about this. Actually, the Weather Makers is the name of the holistic engineering company. And this comes from a book by Professor Tim Flannery. He's an Australian. If you haven't read it, I recommend you read this now. Because what we see is humanity have become weather makers. But we're altering the weather and the climate through ignorance and through greed. And this is very, very dangerous. So that thing that we saw here is just actually not a natural phenomenon. We can see from the core samples that pollen was coming into North Africa, the Middle East, and up into Central Asia from the Indian Ocean over evolutionary time. And at a certain point in historical time, the winds went the other direction. And this, what I have just showed you, is essentially a diagram explaining why this is. So when you have the temperature differentials causing moist air to go into the upper atmosphere, then you need to look at where are the continental divides, because this determines the weather systems. And when you have this kind of air and temperatures, you're creating the winds. You're creating the wind speed and the wind direction. And by reversing the wind direction and having it go up the mountain, you're creating a vacuum. It's like a vacuum cleaner started sucking the moist air out. And it doesn't reach critical mass, which may be around 21 grams of moisture per kilogram of air. And it doesn't allow for nucleation, because the vegetation, which is respirating and sending volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere, is no longer functioning. But you would have maybe dust or something that could be nucleation. But if you don't reach critical mass, you won't have cloud formation and you won't have rain. And when it goes into the upper atmosphere, it's going to leave the region. And when it leaves the region, it's going to come down someplace, and that's probably someplace that doesn't need it. And the place that does need it is not going to be nurtured by this moisture. And if you play that scenario forward for thousands of years, then this is explained. This looks like the reason that the surrounding areas of the cradle of Western civilization is massively degraded. What is the value of understanding what caused this to happen? I've been trying to figure this out. So we have 20 great minds, various research institutes, governments, international agencies, and they have been introduced to this. And no one among them has told me why this is not true. And we started to theorize with many people, how could this be restored? How could we fix this? And we're finding a tremendous amount of data that suggests that we can do it. And that if we do this by fixing the aquatic situation and working from the coast, increasing seagrasses, reed beds, increasing the evaporation, changing the temperature differentials, removing the sedimentation, and bringing the sedimentation onto the shoreline, and then growing grasses, shrubs, and trees, we can change the surface temperatures. We can begin to hold the moisture in the lower atmosphere. And when we do this, we can turn the winds around. And if we do that, we will bring back the moist air from the Indian Ocean, which would then cause a complete change in the entire region. It's not a localized impact. And in order to do this, one of the phenomenon in the Sinai is that there are no legitimate work. There's no legitimate work. There's terrorism. You could choose that. You could, if you don't feel ready for that, you can dig tunnels and smuggle contraband, which might be as simple as toilet paper or cornflakes, but it could also be weapons. So what if we were to achieve a collective intention to restore this area? Is it technically possible to do that? So far, nobody has been able to tell me that it's not technically possible. It's difficult. We're going to have to use, Dr. John Todd has posited that we can use passive solar domes to evaporate seawater, to get fresh water. With the fresh water, we can then have soil, which we're getting out of the sediments, adding organic matter, adding microbial and fungal inoculations, and use this for nursery systems. We also know that there are occasional flash floods there. So we can prepare for the time when actually there will be rain, and we can absorb all of that. And all of that is legitimate work. So instead of saying that the value in the economy comes from buying and selling stuff, we have to realize that the value in the economy comes from restoring the ecological function. So I'm telling you what I think now is the edge of the thinking. And it's very complicated, and I really don't want to go over everything. But I want you to follow this space and to think about this and consider, how can we get on this track that is doing this kind of thing? So we're not going to solve this in four hours today. But I want to tell you that lots of people have been putting lots of thought into how to do this, and we're close. We're close to starting this project. This is just one place in the world. But what this represents is an idea that regeneration is the way forward. So I want to tell you what the Chinese have done, which is, I think, just crazy. Oh, and one more thing. I think this is not a joke. This is the heart. This is the acupuncture point on the earth that allowed, when we changed this, when we altered this, it caused that huge desert phenomenon. So we need to do this. Okay. So this is on my academia page. If you, I'll put up a screen in just a second, but this is what the Chinese have done. This is 427 kilometers through the middle of the Taklamakan Desert. It's ridiculous. The fact that I would not necessarily recommend doing this. It's a bit too much. We have other work to do. But the fact that you can do this is very, very important to understand. So if we can do this, the surface temperature on the sand at noon in July is 70 degrees centigrade. 70 degrees centigrade. And below the vegetative cover, I think that's like 100 anybody calculate? Yes, 150. Your boots melt. It's ridiculous. And below the vegetative the vegetative corridor, it's 25 degrees centigrade. That's a 45 degree temperature differential. So when we start to understand, so I started looking at hydrology and botany and microbiology and all these things in studying about ecological systems. And I finally got to the point where I realized at the very fundamentally degraded states, we're looking at physics. We're not really, the biology, biodiversity is the last thing on your mind when it's 70 degrees and the wind is blowing. That's intense.